constituted the bulk of the people, who in theory were the source of all authority, they were deprived of political power. They neither participated in the imperium of the magistracy, nor could they protect themselves against its abuses. The procedure they adopted to secure reform was secession. They organized themselves into a separate corporation, which held its own assemblies, concilia plebis, appointed its own officers, the tribunes, tribuni plebis. In 459 BC, 2 soon after increased to 10, not to be confused with the tribuni militum, officers of the army, and secured their inviolability by a collective undertaking to protect them. At times of abnormal stress they withdrew en masse from Rome. Between 494 and 287 BC, 5 such secessions are recorded, and there may have been others. During the 200 years of the struggle, the concilium plebis and the tribunes, patricians were excluded from both, were incorporated in the state, and although the concilium did not include the whole of the people, and therefore could not legally pass laws, its resolutions, plebiscita, were eventually given the force of law. Thus, by 287 BC, when the last secession took place, the plebeians won right of admission to all offices, and hence to the Senate. Like the consuls, the persons of the tribunes were sacrosanct during their yearly term of office, and like them, each tribune had power to initiate laws, and to veto not only consular proposals, but also those of his colleagues. In brief, 2 sets of rulers were established to carry out simultaneously the duties of government, but not as a democracy, which under this dual system was impossible. 2 further innovations of importance must be mentioned. The first was that in 366 BC a praetor was elected to supervise the administration of justice in Rome. Later, the number of praetors was increased in order to provide governors for overseas provinces, when to all intents and purposes they were endowed with full consular powers. The second was that in 327 to 326 BC, because the siege of the Greek city of Naples lasted for more than 1 year, in order to retain the consul commanding the besieging army in office, he was appointed by the assembly to act as proconsul, that is, to carry on the siege as though he was still a consul. This device of increasing the number of officers with imperium, without altering the number of consuls and their annual term of office, came increasingly into use, and eventually became a leading factor in the civil wars which wrecked the Republic. 2. Influences of overseas expansion. During the 226 years which separate the victory of the Romans over the Latin cities at Lake Regillus in 498 BC, and the submission to them of the Greek cities of Tarentum, Taranto, and Regium, Regio, in 272 BC, Rome gradually extended her rule over the whole of Italy south of the Apennines. The many wars waged between these dates were fought to establish her security within Italy. But once Regium was occupied, her problem became how to secure Italy from without, and as no more than 3.5 miles of water separated the Romans from the Carthaginians in Sicily, the impulse of security led to the First and Second Punic Wars. In the first, fought between 264 and 241 BC, Rome acquired Sicily, the first of her provinces. And in 238 BC, with doubtful faith, she deprived Carthage of Sardinia, which, together with Corsica, became her second province. Next, in 218 BC, came the Second Punic War, which in 202 BC was ended by the defeat of Hannibal at the hands of Scipio Africanus at Zama. In accordance with the terms of peace, the whole of Spain was annexed to Rome and organized into 2 provinces. Thus Rome became mistress of the western Mediterranean. During the Second Punic War, Philip V of Macedon entered into treaty with Hannibal and took up arms against Rome. This led to the First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BC, a conflict of small account. But immediately after the Roman-Carthaginian peace, Philip's aggressive policy precipitated the Second Macedonian War, 200 to 194 BC, and in 197 BC led to his defeat at Kynoskephalae. Out of that conflict emerged a series of wars which occupied the next half-century. First, a war with Antiochus III of Syria, 192 to 190 BC, and his defeat at Magnesia. Next, the Third Macedonian War, 171 to 168 BC, with Perseus, son and successor of Philip V, who was defeated at Pydna and whose kingdom became a Roman province. Then came the Third Punic War, 149 to 146 BC, which led to the destruction of Carthage and to Africa being added to the provinces. And lastly to a war with the Achaean League in 148 BC, which 2 years later resulted in the destruction of Corinth, Thebes, and Chalcis. Thus, 56 years after Zama, Rome became mistress of the eastern Mediterranean. The impact of these wars on the Republic was profound, because the popular assemblies were incapable of arriving at quick decisions, and because the people were ill-informed and scattered. The conduct of war automatically passed into the hands of the Senate, which, from an advisory body, developed into a supreme war council. The sovereignty of the people was so completely subordinated to its will that the assemblies were no longer even asked to agree with its decisions. Further, the successful outcome of the wars added enormously to the prestige of the Senate. Simultaneously, other changes supervened, which ultimately undermined the authority of the Senate and corrupted the Republic. The most important was the emergence of a capitalist class, and with it the growth of a money economy. Wars of the ancient world differed from those of today, in that frequently they were highly profitable. After coinage became a medium of exchange, the need for bullion grew more and more pressing, and as the mining of the precious metals was rudimentary, and because the Romans never took to industry, war was the main means of obtaining them. Further, a shortage of money led to high rates of interest, to unredeemable debts, and agitation for their remission. And when the demand for money outstripped its supply, as Mommsen says, war became a traffic of plunder. Tenny Frank has computed that between 200 and 167 BC, the Roman generals brought back in booty 31,000 pounds of gold and 669,000 pounds of silver, besides which the Roman treasury received in indemnities something like 5 million pounds. In addition to this, the generals and their armies, as well as the tax-gatherers, appropriated in perquisites vast sums of money. So considerable were the profits accruing from the wars in the East that in 167 BC all direct taxes in Italy were discontinued, and henceforth the expenses of the state were met by the tribute of the provinces. As corrupting as the influx of precious metals was the enormous extension of slavery, which, because slave power was the classical equivalent of modern steam power, led to economic and social changes as profound as those which emerged out of the Industrial Revolution in the 19th century. Although, since times immemorial, slavery had existed among the Romans, it was only after the Second Punic War that it took a steep upward course. Unlike in modern wars, prisoners were not looked upon as an encumbrance, but as an indemnity toward meeting the cost of a campaign. And frequently their capture was more profitable than the loot acquired. It is therefore no surprise to learn that armies were followed by bands of speculators in the slave trade, who made vast fortunes out of the prisoners auctioned. On occasions, the number made available is staggering. After the Battle of Pydna, Aemilius Paulus sold into slavery 150,000 of the free inhabitants of Epirus. After the battles of Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae, 60,000 Cimbri and 90,000 Teutoni, respectively, were sold by Marius. and on one occasion during his Gallic War, Caesar sold 53,000.